Well, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to ALBW Live. I'm Pat Escate. I am the lead organizer of Ann Lister Birthday Week. And I am so happy to have you in today. It's just been such a delight doing all of these interviews. And partially what's fun about them is I get to talk to really interesting people. And also because we get to dive into a lot of the history that surrounds the real Gentleman Jack, Ann Lister, and of course, Ann Walker. And today, I'm particularly excited because we get to talk to two people that are just fonts of knowledge when it comes to this subject. These are two people that I met on my very first trip to Halifax back in 2019. And I think you're going to very much enjoy what they have to say today about some of the characters that you've come to know in the series and who actually were real life people. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome them to ALBW Live. And there's Dorothy, and soon we'll see Ian. Let me introduce these two fine people to you. This is Ian Philp, and he is the chair of St. Matthew's Churchyard, and Dorothy Barker, who is the secretary. And I'm honored to have gotten to meet both of these people in my first visit to Halifax and have maintained a really wonderful email connection with them ever since. Especially Dorothy, who is constantly researching new information about the churchyard and sends out some really interesting emails regarding all that history. So we're going to be talking about some of that today. Before we get started, I do want to let you know that we have a little bit of a technical difficulty today with the laptop that I've been forced to use because my other one decided not to work this morning. And we may have a little bit of a sound blip every once in a while that gets quite loud and kind of bounces in. Some of you who've been watching ALBW Live for a while may remember this from the past, but we'll get past it pretty quickly. And just warning you, it's the ghost in the machine because it's Halloween. So anyway. Now, so I'd like to start out with my two fine guests, talking a little bit about the Walker family and their relationship with the Whitecliff area. Ian, Dorothy, who would like to discuss that a little bit to start with?
Go on, Dorothy. Do a little bit of the history.
Right. Well, the Walkers have been in Whitecliff for quite a long time. We have somebody at what was called Lower Crow Nest Farm. They then did very well and continued to buy land and then to build houses. And they built these two really quite magnificent houses of Crow Nest and Cliff Hill, which Ian can tell you more about.
Yes.
Okay. What we do know is that William Walker, that's Anne's grandfather, must have been very wealthy, certainly had a huge interest in what was going on in and around the two mansions, and was church warden at the time that they were discussing whether in fact the church itself should be rebuilt. The original church was 1529. 250 years later, understandably, it needed a lot of work doing to it. And all of the applications, all of the permissions, virtually everything has William Walker's signature on it.
Wow.
So when it came to building, and Dorothy found this, there was an advert placed for craftsmen, and they had to report at a certain time in the afternoon if they were interested in taking on these tasks. The story goes that he went to the Baltic to select the appropriate timbers for the roof of the two mansions and for the chapel.
Wow.
There was quite a trade anyway between the Baltics and the United Kingdom in terms of timber. Then it came across, and we reckon it was one of the first big loads that came from Hull through the Humber to the brand new Ayr and Collardale navigation.
Wow.
So there was a huge interest, I think, and as far as we can tell, he was the main sponsor for what we call our church, the one that was 1775.
Right. And then that church that was built in 1775, that church only lasted for about 100 years. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
When was the new St. Matthew's built?
1875.
1875.
Yes. Just 100 years.
For those of you who have not been to Halifax yet, the quote new St. Matthew's Church is really just right up the street from St. Matthew's Churchyard, Lightcliff. And so you can also see that church when you're visiting. So Anne Walker, the Walkers and Anne Walker really used St. Matthew's Lightcliff as their home church. Anne was living, again, not very far away at Lydgate House. And for most of you who have come to know Anne Walker vis-a-vis Gentleman Jack, she wasn't living at Cliff Hill. She wasn't living at Crow Nest. She had moved into to what we've always kind of assumed was a smaller home until just recently, quite frankly, I finally came across a picture that was an aerial shot of Lydgate House that I have to assume was taken in the early 1900s because it's in the air and they weren't flying around prior to that. But I'm guessing it must have been around World War I. Don't you think, Ian, Dorothy, that this picture was taken because it's the property is still quite large?
Oh, yes. And the property, of course, is still there, but it's now subdivided.
Right.
I don't think it would have looked exactly like that in Anne Walker's time. For instance, the bay windows, I think, I'm fairly sure, would have been added at a later stage.
Ah, interesting. Yeah. And
but nonetheless, the footprint will be much the same.
Right, the barns and this, it looks like there's barn, carriage house and a stables back kind of back
That's
around the
right.
courtyard.
Yes.
Yeah. And now, of course, for those of you who have been to Halifax and have tried to find Lydgate, it is still there. As Ian just said, it's been developed and we're showing you some pictures of that right now. And the house itself is actually sort of back behind fences and vegetation. You don't really get a great view of it while you're looking for it especially without being rude. But it's really, really hard to tell what the story is with that. Tell us a little bit about that sundial that's on the wall, Ian.
Well, if we knew for sure, but I mean, that gives a date of what, 1720 or something like that.
Yeah.
And the initials don't correspond to any Walker, but the final initial is not a W. But Dorothy is suggesting is that it was in the Walker family, probably within a year or so of that sundial going up. That, of course, assumes that the sundial is original. If we don't know, it could well, of course, have been moved from one house to another, but no reason really to expect it to be other than genuine.
Right. But it is interesting to see it in person, obviously. And for those of you who might be curious, with all those quick walks that Ann Lister was taking to go over and see Anne Walker, it's about a 2-mile distance between Shibden Hall and that central area of Lightcliff that Cliff Hill and Crow Nest and Lydgate are all there. Now, as far as those structures themselves, Cliff Hill was torn down in the 60s, I believe. Is that correct?
Nope.
Oh, no, Crow Nest.
Crow Nest was.
Sorry.
Yes, Crow Nest. Crow Nest went. I'm guessing around about 1920 or so. I think it was First World War. People were no longer living there. It was used for all sorts of things in terms of chemicals for World War I. Part of it was dug up for quarry stone
Wow.
And the whole place just went to rack and ruin.
Yeah.
It would be too huge for anyone wanting to take it over. So
Right.
it went. Yeah.
Right. So there's a golf club there now, right?
There is indeed. Yes.
Yeah. And if you're taking a tour with somebody, say, like David Glover, there's a lane that kind of skirts the side of the property, and you get down about halfway and you can see some of the original gates to the estate, but that's really, that's all that's left there. Cliff Hill, on the other hand, did survive and is still standing. It's condos now.
It's split into different houses, yes.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that is private property, so you can't
Absolutely,
get that.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and so those are the three main houses that made up the estate. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. Once Anne Lister and Anne Walker made their commitment to one another, they chose to worship at St. Matthew's, correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we have this lovely quote in Anne Lister's diary that she writes to Mr. Wilkinson, the Reverend Wilkinson, who incidentally, his youngest daughter is Lydia Wilkinson, who was a good friend of Anne Walker's. Then she married another vicar called George Fenton. And then in the 1851 census, Lydia Fenton is Anne Walker's housekeeper. So there's obviously the Walkers and the Wilkinsons know each other well. But yes, there's a diary entry, September 1834, wrote compliments to Mr. Wilkinson and to inquire whether there was a front gallery pew at liberty in Whitecliff Church and what would be the annual rent. If not, begged to know what pews were at liberty, as during my stay at home, should be glad to be one of Mr. W.'s congregation if I could get a good pew, which he did.
There you have it. And we do have a picture of that with that particular pew, or what we think that particular pew might be, circled in red. And of course, you're seeing that picture. There were two of them that we've been showing you. One is the church with the pews existing at that time. And then, of course, as the church went into demolition. Anne Walker, as we all know, was eventually buried at St. Matthew's Churchyard, or actually in St. Matthew's Church. Let's talk a little bit about that, because for a while, there was a little bit of conflict going on in terms of where did she actually get buried. It says that she's buried under the pulpit.
Yes.
And that says that was that on the windows, or was that no, that's on the memorial, right?
Yes, the memorial was placed in a north window at the east end, because on a picture that you'll see in a little bit, there's a blanked out window on the left-hand side.
Right.
And we're fairly certain that's where it was.
Right.
The reason, and it's an odd one, and it's the one that caused a lot of speculation, is why would you be buried under a pulpit? And the answer to that is that the pulpit wasn't there at the time that Anne was buried. Probably in those days, what happened was that where the vaults were under the pews. When it came to a burial, move the pews, lift the floorboards and the top of the vault, put the body in, put it all back in, seal it.
Right.
Sealing it, of course, was an important thing to do. And then put the pews back. What happened is that she would have been buried like that with her aunts. And then probably about 10 years later, Evan Charles Sutherland Walker, her nephew, did a major amount of work on the inside of the church, which included putting two pulpits in. And the one on the north side almost certainly would have been where Anne was buried. So that's why she's buried under the pulpit.
Right. And unlike the Halifax Minster, when you visit the Halifax Minster, it's a stone floor, and those stones are actually the ledger stones for the people that are buried underneath there. With St. Matthew's, there was actually a wood floor on top of the area that they were buried on. So you wouldn't see the same kind of stones. You just,
No.
yeah.
We-
In fact,
and
there
of
probably
course-
wasn't any kind of stone there, right?
There probably was, but we've no idea. It's
Right.
certainly now buried beneath 2 feet of protection.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah. So, so again, at that time, when Ann Walker was buried, the church looked different from what we're seeing in these photographs. And as Ian has mentioned, her nephew, Evan Charles Walker Sutherland, he had to take the name Walker in order to inherit the estate from Ann Walker, went through a major renovation. And part of that renovation was, well, there were several things. He, I believe it was him that paid for the copper plaque that became the memorial to Ann Walker.
Absolutely. It must be, because other members of the family are there.
Right.
And this is including 2 who died and were buried in Scotland.
Right.
So it's as though he's remembering his aunt and other relatives,
Brothers.
in Lightcliffe, whether they were buried in Lightcliffe or not. So yes,
Right.
he must have done that.
Right, and the stained glass window that he put in, which you're seeing, you've either already seen or you're seeing now, was a 3-part stained glass window. It was put in to memorialize his parents.
Yes.
In the middle. I'm not sure who would. I know on the right-hand side he is memorializing Ann Walker, but who was it on the left again in that part of the?
It's young William, wasn't it?
William Sutherland Walker, who was Evan Charles's firstborn. Usually the firstborn son was William, secondborn son was John.
Oh, I see. And why was that? Why would that be? Because it
just family tradition, I think.
Okay. So Evan Charles Walker Sutherland, having inherited the estate, stayed in Lightcliffe for about 10, 15 years. Am I right about that?
Yes, it was quite strange, really, because he'd inherited in 1854. He was improving the church. Mid 1860s, he put a very big amount of money into establishing a school, which is still there.
Yeah.
And then 1867, everything is being put up for sale, and he's moving out. And that was, it must have been a very big surprise to everyone in the area.
Right, because the entire thing went up for auction. I know Ian, you've done some research on this and have found the auction
Yes. Yeah.
flyers, right?
Yeah.
And it's very, it's sort of sad when you look at this flyer, because it's all right there: Crow Nest, Cliff Hill, Lydgate House, the entire estate, which was no small piece of land. I think it was about 700 acres.
Yes, yeah.
And that was the end of the Walkers in the area once that was all gone.
Yep.
Yes, he although he moved up to northeast Scotland, he still had some interest in the area, because in 1875, when the new church was built, he provided the money for the organ, and his wife, Alice Sophia, I think,
yes,
provided one of the bells. So there was still that interest, even though he'd moved away. But having said that, you were talking about the auction, probably 2/3 didn't sell straight away.
Oh,
so
really?
Until about 1890, when everything else went, he was still receiving income, but also selling off some of the things which hadn't sold in 1867 or within a few months of the auction.
And when Titus Salt bought Cliff Hill, what year was that in, or around?
Cronest.
Titus Salt bought. Of course, he'd been earlier a tenant there, so he had an interest in buying it when it came on the market, and he didn't bid but not up to the reserve, and they came to an agreement within months of the sale in 67. So I think it's dated 67, 68 when he took ownership of Cronest.
So wait a minute, why am I thinking that he bought, oh, that's the only thing that's left of Cronest, is that carriage house at the end, is that it?
Yeah,
Oh,
the gatehouse.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, there is a lodge at the entrance to the new road the new drive into Cronest.
right.
And yes, that's the only thing that's left, apart from the lake.
Right. Yeah, I was picturing that, and that's how I put that Cliff Hill thing together. So now we've got we've moved into that part of time. And then the church itself gets scheduled for demolition in about the time they decided to build the new one, correct? Or did it sit there for a while? When did it get demolished?
It's sat there for a year, for 100 years.
For years, yeah.
Wow.
It was used as I don't think they really knew what to do with it. It was used as a chapel for funerals. And I'm told by someone who used to worship there, used to worship there on a once a year basis. I think they kept it going as a consecrated building under those circumstances.
Wow.
And then I think the church had got to the stage where it could not possibly afford or justify it. And that's when the decisions about demolishing came along.
Right. And in the pictures that you're seeing now of the church during demolition, you will see on the photograph that shows the church as a whole, you'll see that blocked out window that Ian's referring to, which is where Ann Walker's memorial was placed. All the rest of the windows were left as operating windows. So now let's move a little bit into, so once the building's been demolished, how did that decision get made to keep the tower? Why didn't they knock that down?
I think the church would have been quite happy to have said, yes, the whole lot goes once the decision was made. The group called Friends of Friendless Churches, who now are responsible for it, there was a long conversation between the parish, the diocese, and the Friends of Friendless Churches as to whether, in fact, the whole lot could be retained, because there were lots of interesting architectural details in the church itself. But a compromise had to be made. The Friends of Friendless Churches were a very new organization. They had very little money at the time. They'd probably say they have very little money now. And it was decided that the tower would be kept.
Okay.
And they would restore or put right the east side of it where the church had been. And that's what you see in the photograph.
Right. So that one wall is finished. Now, the interesting thing is, for those of you who are curious about what happened with the memorials, some of you have been lucky enough to be inside the tower, and you know that there are several Walker memorials in the tower. Let's talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I'll start that one with the Greek goddess, which is the plaque to commemorate John Walker, and Elizabeth's brother. And as you'll know, he died on honeymoon in Naples. And she put that up in memory of him, presumably within 2 or 3 years of the death. clearly after she'd returned. And she would have had quite a bit of money after the settlement that came out of that relationship. And this is the little aside that Patty's allowing me to do, because I like links. Dorothy's already smiling at this. Fanny Penfold's younger brother, Christopher, who was a doctor, believed in the medicinal powers of fortified wine. He emigrated to Adelaide, decided he'd plant a vineyard, and that is still going. In fact, you might just be able to see that the Penfold name lives on.
That's right.
And a very good red wine.
There you go.
So that's my bit on there.
I love that. And for those of you who may not have caught the reference, Fanny Penfold was the wife of John.
Sorry, yes, of course, yes.
Yeah. So an interesting connection.
Yeah, and then there are the connections, because the Penfold who went to Australia, his middle name is Rawson. And some of that family had Rawson as the middle name. Now, it's very complicated, too complicated to explain, but there is a link between the Rawsons and the Penfolds, and then, of course, the Penfolds and the Walkers.
Right.
And this lady actually remarries, and there's a lovely thing in the Anne Lister diaries explaining that she told her uncle, one of the Rawsons, that she wasn't going to remarry. The person she remarried, who is a Kenny, and is linked to Dr. Kenny, and
wow,
his nephew was who she married, and he knew that she was going to get married. So they were each telling their uncles different things. But they did end up marrying. Sadly, she didn't live very much longer after that.
Oh, that's a shame. Yeah. It's interesting. Your mention of the Rawsons as their connection with Penfolds and with the Walkers. Some of you who are listening today may not have gotten the news earlier this week that all this time we've believed that we had nothing left of Anne Walker, any of her journals or diaries, etc. And earlier this week, it was announced that one of Anne Walker's diaries or travel journals had been found, and that's being transcribed right now. And it was found in the Rawson archive, of all places.
Yeah.
But it was listed in the Rawson archive as an Anne Lister journal. Yeah. Probably because it looks very much like one of Anne Lister's journal with the mottled paper and the leather spine, etc. But just one quick little reference that Dorothy asked me about just before we came on. So I haven't actually read through this, but today on Twitter, which connects all of these properties with the two people we're here to talk about. This is from Anne's diary, out at 2:25 to meet A, meaning Anne Walker, not at Lydgate, not at Cliff Hill at 3:5 to 3:25, A not there, back by Lydgate to Lightcliff Church. Here we are again, peeped in at the windows and she was not there. She was to take Old Washington to go and see about the pews. In passing Lydgate, saw little Susan and A not there. Fancied I had missed her, took shelter at Hardcastle's for a few minutes, home at 4:30, rainy for some time after, heated and uneasy at finding A not returned. A safe back about 5:30, not much, or rather very little wet. So there you have all the places that we're talking about today, all tied up in one thing and found in the Rawson archive. So it's fascinating to me. And I know, Dorothy, you spend a lot of time with the archives with all the information that you send out in your emails and post to the site. But it just goes to show how much more may be buried in there someplace.
Yeah.
It's, I love how everyone is, kept track of all that. So that was John Walker's memorial. And then, of course, we have another memorial that's actually to the Walker family that's also hanging inside the tower. and Steph has probably got that picture up now. That's Anne's parents.
Yeah.
That
And
memorializes.
I think it's Anne's parents. I think there's a niece. It's basically a memorial to those mentioned on the ledger stone, which is just outside the church.
Right, right. And we'll talk about that when we get to the ledger stones here in a minute. And then last but certainly not least, for most of the fans of Gentleman Jack and those Anne Lister scholars and Anne Walker scholars that are here, is the actual memorial to Anne Walker that at one time was in that blanked out window in the church. Tell us a little bit about that.
Ian?
I thought you were going to run through that one.
All right. Well,
okay, Dorothy.
It was in the window, the blocked out window, which is why we think we've identified the pulpit that she was buried underneath. Unlike the smaller plaques to her two maiden aunts, Aunt Mary and Aunt Anne, we assume that it was too big to go in the new church, or that the new church didn't want it. So it was moved into the tower with the memorial to her brother. There's another one to a vicar. Is it Sutcliffe or is it Wilkinson? And they're just there in the tower now.
Right.
That's bearing in mind that these were rescued in this particular case by friends of friendless churches.
Yeah.
Some memorials we know were on the walls, but they must have been broken, vandalized in the last year or so of the church's existence. So I think we're very grateful that any of them were claimed and taken back.
Absolutely.
So at least inside the tower, although obviously it's not readily available for viewing, nonetheless, they are still there.
And which is a perfect segue to another one of the photographs that we have, which is the line of people waiting to get into the tower last year in 2019.
Yes.
Yeah, that's not open normally. So tell us a little bit about that, Ian, because you're the one that holds the key.
Yes. When that was open for the public as a whole, that was the first time since the tower or the church had been demolished.
Wow.
And we had no idea what the response was going to be. We were going to open at 12 and close at 4. We were ready to open at 11. The queue had started, and we weren't going to let anyone at 4 o'clock be disappointed. And so we kept it running to, what was it, nearly 6 or something like that.
Yeah.
We were just amazed by the number of people. A lot of local people, out of genuine curiosity, well, why is the tower there and what's inside? And then a lot of the people who are interested in the Anne Walker history came along as well. Children, dogs, 600 or so in the day.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
We were going to do it again, obviously, this year.
Yes.
And next year.
Indeed.
Next year.
Hopefully. Yes.
Hopefully. Yeah. I have to say, I was fortunate enough to get a view of the inside of the tower when I first went to Halifax and did my tour with David Glover. And like many of the places that are connected to Anne Lister and Anne Walker, there is, it's a really, there's a sense of something special when you're allowed to view these things. But one of the markers that we haven't talked about that's still in the tower that I found especially interesting, there's some kind of board that's kind of leaning up against the wall that speaks to the Walkers' donations to the church, or in general of how the church had been taken care of and their largesse, isn't it? Isn't that there's that one long piece that's up there?
Yes, it's good that it's there, but unfortunately it's screwed into the wall for security. But it's vertical rather than horizontal, and there's a ladder fixed in front of it, so you can't take a decent photograph. Right. But yes, it lists the people going back probably 400 years, the original people who were giving money for the poor in the area. And that continued. William Walker took that a stage further.
Right.
Persuading, I'm not sure how you say persuade when it might be arm up the back, a lot of his friends to be donating monies. But also we have records of Anne Walker putting money on one side, and that charity continued for 150 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And as I recall, what was in her will or wherever that was listed, I think it was £10 a year, which was no small amount of money back then.
No, I mean, you add another 2 noughts onto that.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Just for the poor, which was really quite special. So let's move into the churchyard itself and talk about some of the people that are buried there. And Steph is putting up a picture for us that shows a bird's eye view of the churchyard with the tower in the center. And I asked her to do this just so that you could get a feel for where everybody is buried and their relationship spatially between them. Of course, the one that most people are interested in, and we will talk more about this in a while, is Anne Walker's burial place, which of course, well, we'll get to that in a bit. But one of the things that I find interesting about this bird's eye view is the fact that you can see the outline of the old church, mostly on the right side, but if you look close enough, you'll see that it's mirrored on the left side. And that gives you a little bit of a feel for how the church stood in relationship to the rest of the churchyard itself. And as we've talked about, there are many people that are buried there that were part of the Gentleman Jack and the whole story of Anne Lister and Anne Walker. Let's start with the Walker's stone. If you'd like to, Steph's going to have the picture up, but if you could talk a little bit about the people that are on there and the story that tells.
Well, that's the ledger stone just outside the east end of the church. And the first name, as it is on a lot of ledger stones, is actually a small baby. It's Anne Walker's older brother. He died at 3 weeks, something like 1798. And of course, at that time, Anne Walker's father didn't expect, he wasn't the eldest son, he did not expect to inherit. So they lived at Cliff Hill, and obviously they bought this plot just outside the east end of the church. Then Anne Walker's older sister, Mary, died as a teenager. She's also buried there. And then when her parents died in 1823, both of them are there. And then there's one more, which is George Makai Sutherland and Elizabeth Sutherland's daughter, Mary Sutherland, and she is the last one on that ledger stone.
So that filled up that grave, right? That's why Anne's not buried there?
That the grave then is full.
Okay, right.
It has 2 adults, 2 teenagers, and a small baby.
Right. And just to illuminate this a little bit, generally speaking, the way this happened in churchyards is that the original grave was dug very deep, right? And then they just kind of stacked them up.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Interest of saving space.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be hearing more about that as we hear more about, which we will discuss at some point, Halifax Minster and where Anne Lister's buried. Now, the second one that I've got on my list is Samuel Washington, who, of course, was the land agent and steward to Anne Lister, right? But started out with Anne Walker. Tell us more about them.
Yeah, Samuel Washington began as the Crow Nest land steward, land agent. His father, actually, James, which in the text the tweet that you just read out, I'm fairly sure will be Old Washington.
Oh, that's the Old Washington. I wondered about.
That will be Old Washington.
Okay.
And I believe that he was bookkeeper to the Crow Nest Walkers for about 50 years.
Oh, wow.
He's buried in the churchyard. His wife's relatives are buried in the churchyard. So Samuel Washington would always know about Crow Nest and the Walkers, and he ended up working for them. The BBC says he has 6 energetic daughters. He did actually have a son, but like a lot, this little boy, Edward, died very early, and his is the first name on the Washington ledger stones, which are up by the West Wall.
Okay. So
Then, of course, there are the daughters, including Susanna, who died aged 22 and did not marry the non-existent Thomas Sworden.
which we're going to get to in a minute. And we do have a couple of documents also in photograph here while we're talking about Samuel Washington. Tell us a little bit about those, Ian.
Yes, the main one is the accounts that Samuel Washington had to draw up for the committee during the lunacy of Anne.
Yeah.
Meticulous documents. I have every admiration for Samuel Washington, because he was doing the Walker estate, the Shibden estate, and found out in the last couple of days he was also church warden. At the same time, he was doing all of these and producing full accounts for the church as well. But the documentation gives us a very good idea of what Anne owned in the 1840s. In other words, basically what she'd inherited, and down to small cottages, up to big farms, 4 pubs, and how much rent they were getting. And he must have done an awful lot of traveling around, because not only was the property in the Lightcliffe area, Anne Walker owned property in the middle of Halifax, next to the Peace Hall, for instance.
Oh, wow.
So the outlying villages. In fact, we've only just found out, or I have only just found out, there'd been an entry for a place called Mulson Place. We knew that she had property in Stainland. And I think it was only yesterday we worked out that Mulson Place was in Stainland, which brought those two together. And then the property existed, and he had to travel and sort out any difficulties with 2 mills that they owned in Honley, which is 15 miles south from here. That's a long way when in those days, in terms of...
Yeah, that was, you didn't just like drive over in 10 minutes, right?
No. And it was well worth it, because the income or the rental looks to be about the equivalent of £30,000 a year.
Not bad.
From those 2 mills.
She was a very wealthy young woman.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Well into the millions. And let us all let us all remember that was back when the money had a lot more value and taxes were not as onerous as they are now. So that bought a lot. So it's interesting to see that when you go through the papers. Now, the other thing that those documents show is Samuel Washington's relationship to Lydgate House, correct?
Yes, he lived there.
Yes, he lived there. Yeah.
I think one of the surprising things is that looking at that information, you find out that midway through the 1840s, the person or the family who'd been renting Lydgate House took out a rental, and I find this interesting, in 1832 for a 10-year period, which implies to me that Anne Walker knew that she wouldn't be going back to Lydgate in the near future. When that 10-year lease came up, it was Samuel Washington's job, first of all, to advertise and find a new tenant. I don't know how hard he tried, but he finished up living there. So for the next good number of years, he was the tenant of Lydgate House.
Nice. It's a beautiful house. Good for him.
Yeah.
And then we also have the next stone that we have is James Himscliff, who we met in Gentleman Jack. But tell us a little bit about him.
Well, James Himscliff was the Lightcliffe coal merchant. I believe he also owned some coal pits. And he seems to be quite a strong man in that he was quite willing to disagree with Anne Lister. Now, there's an interesting story with that. because if you read the Anne Lister diaries, at some point she refuses to give James Hinchcliffe's son a job on the Shibden Hall estate. Why? Because his father is yellow and not blue. In other words, his father doesn't vote for who she wants him to vote for, yellow being the Whigs, blue being the Tories.
Wow.
And so her poor son, who's also buried in the churchyard, doesn't get 2 jobs at least.
Wow. Well, as they say, and a good thing for our American audience to remember, elections have consequences. Make sure you vote.
Yeah.
Oh, and then next on the list we have Sam Sowden.
Right, Samuel Sworden, who I do understand that Sally Wainwright now apologizes because we don't know why she chose this name. But this gentleman, who's also a church warden at the church, had 6 sons and 4 daughters. 2 sons become vicars. Both of them know the Brontes very well. One of them marries Charlotte Bronte and Arthur Bell Nichols, and then sadly takes her funeral. So I think this man was not as portrayed in Gentleman Jack. I have recently been in contact with a lady from Canada who thought that Samuel Sworden and his wife were some of her ancestors because there was family folklore that they had brought up a 3 times great-grandmother. And it turns out that this lady's ancestors are not a direct descendants, but they're actually the descendants of one of his brothers. And when the brother lost his wife, it looks as if Samuel Sworden and his wife then looked after 2 little girls.
Oh, wow.
So this gentleman who had 10 children of his own then seems to have looked after his brother's children who lost their mother.
Oh, wow.
And he died, he lived a good age. He's the very last name on that ledger stone. Apparently he was blind by the time he died. He was something to do with Hipperholm Grammar School. He was a church warden. Yes.
Well, I'm glad we could set that record straight.
Yeah.
Because he certainly doesn't get that play on the show, but that's the character. Somebody else who's buried in the churchyard, and Ian and I have kind of an ongoing conversation about this gentleman, is Captain George Makai Sutherland. And he's buried sort of catty-cornered from where Anne Walker is. Let's talk a little bit about him and why his stone says George Makai Sutherland of Shibden Hall.
Because he would die at Shibden Hall. Because I think he had to live there in order to act as the committee for Anne Walker. His daughter dies at Shibden Hall. Remember, I mentioned that she's on the Walker ledger stone. That also says of Shibden Hall. So yes, he was living in the area, and that's where he's buried. And just in front of him, there is this rhododendron bush. And then the next steward, once Samuel Washington dies, the next steward is brought down by Evan Charles Southern Walker.
Oh, right.
It's a Scotsman called John Smith. And he comes down and he lives in I think he lives somewhere in Lydgate, not Lydgate House. And then he lives at Lower Crow Nest Farm. He's buried there. 3 of his children very sadly died on 3 consecutive days at the beginning of 1 year, and they're buried there.
Wow.
His wife is close by. So yeah, I sometimes wonder whether George Makai Sutherland or his son bought up more than 1 plot, which is why then Evan Charles Sutherland Walker's steward is buried close by.
Right. I didn't realize that his steward died in the area.
Yes. Yeah.
He did not go back up to Scotland.
No.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. It just as an aside, I know that he had to live in the area because he was on the committee for Anne Walker, but he didn't have to live at Shibden Hall. but he chose to. It still gets my blood up. So in any case, let's talk a little bit about Anne Walker and where she's buried. And as most people who have been following the real Anne Walker since learning about her in Gentleman Jack are aware, that there is no ledger stone for Anne Walker. There is only a small piece of stone that somebody's written something with a Sharpie. And this isn't out of any kind of wanting to ignore her. Ian, let's talk a little bit about why that stone is there and why there isn't something else.
It's easier to do the first. What we were finding is that there were a lot of people coming and looking for where she was buried. We had a little plaque, well, it's still there, by one of the information boards at the foot of the tower.
Right.
But people wanted to be more exact. And rather than being interrupted when we were doing working parties or whatever, to try and show people where it was easier to put a small piece of Yorkshire stone. And yes, I wrote the name and the dates, and like we clean it every now and then. Nice. We keep it as tidy as we possibly can. And we've now found that we've got two unknowns who come along and cut the rectangle with shears or something. We don't know.
Wow.
But that's lovely. It's great.
Isn't
but
that nice?
We keep the area as tidy as we can, but that's the reason that there's a small stone there. And it certainly is not in any way disrespectful. Anything else, it's not our responsibility. We're responsible for the looking after the churchyard. The churchyard is owned by the local parish church. Anything that was to go there would have to be decided and requested from the church itself.
Right.
And where that is now, I don't know. So we're just keeping the little stone there until a decision is made one way or the other.
Right. And the good people at In Search of Anne Walker have been involved in a lot of conversations with you and with the church, et cetera, about whether or not there's something that could be done. I honestly don't know what the latest news is on that. But one of the things that the two of you have mentioned from time to time was the idea of possibly doing a renovation isn't the right word, but cleaning up the copper plaque that's in the tower. Has anything happened on that? Is anybody?
I really don't know, because I think the ownership of the plaque rests with the Friends of Friendless Churches.
Okay.
They would have strong views as to how any kind of renovation or cleaning was done. And is it worth cleaning something which is going to be kept in the tower?
Right, just hidden.
You can see it when we're able to open it.
Right.
I don't know.
Right, and there's certainly something about seeing it in its current form that is very evocative all on its own.
Yes.
So we are getting very close to the end of our time, but before we go into a Q&A, I want to talk a little bit, or allow you two to talk a little bit about the organizations. We've talked about the Friends of Friendless Churches, that is the owner of the tower. But the Friends of St. Matthew's Churchyard, that the two of you represent, talk about worthy work. We should have a photograph up right now of a bunch of weeds.
Yes.
And that was the churchyard before the work started to be done, correct?
Yes. I'll say 2012, 2013, the Friends got together and started to clear an incredibly difficult job. You could walk into that churchyard, not particularly the front, the main churchyard. You couldn't see headstones. Wow. It was just so totally overgrown. There weren't paths through. Only in winter, when everything was dire, could people walk through. The front part, which is cut by the council, but we do the intricate stuff. They cut the grass, but most of the legistones that you've seen this evening, in fact, would have been covered almost entirely with turfs of grass. We cleared those to find out who was buried and where.
Wow.
And we got a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund. We get a little bit of money from the local council, and we raise the rest ourselves. We've now got the machinery, and we've got willing volunteers once a month who come along and help us keep it clear.
Right. So we do have a link for lightcliffchurchyard.org.uk. There's a donate button there. Every little penny helps. So if you have an extra
certainly
£5,
does.
put it
Yes.
in.
Yes, please.
Thank you for taking the time to go through this. Now we have questions. Let's see. This is a question from Lynn Schulz. Did Evan Charles Walker Sutherland's auction sale include personal effects or chattels?
No. The auction that we've got in great detail was all property. So from the mansions through to cottages, pieces of land, the pubs, blacksmiths, and so on, but nothing in the way of any property, personal properties are mentioned.
Wow. Do you have any, just as an aside, do you have any idea what would happen with those kinds of things? Was it just, how does anything wind up in the archive? It's just stuff that people give to the archives?
Yes, I think so. Really, it's a good question. I have no idea.
Yeah.
I was in the West Yorkshire Archives yesterday, and there was a little leather wallet belonging to William Walker.
Oh, wow.
And inside were the correspondence, the invoices for people buying pews, as they had to do in those days.
Wow.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And were you able to, I'm assuming you're going to be able to connect them to certain people that are buried in the churchyard at some point, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
That's great.
Yes. Yeah.
I am a huge history fan, and I'm also a big fan of graveyards, because there's some beautiful statuary in them. They make really nice parks. And Lightcliff is special for any number of reasons. And it certainly isn't just the Gentleman Jack people that are there. There's World War I veterans and all sorts of things. It's just a really great place to visit. Here's a question from Patricia Book. Is there any information regarding Anne Walker's funeral? What do we know about that?
No.
Absolutely not.
Apart from one letter from Charles Musgrave,
right,
who took the service.
Yes.
And didn't he write to somebody saying he buried Miss Walker with her family in the church?
Yes. Yeah, I remember David Glover pointed that out to me when I was at Halifax Minster. For those of you who have been to the Minster or have seen pictures, Charles Musgrave is the gentleman who is buried at the north end of the church, I believe it is. And there's a catafalque there that has a big sculpture of him laying on top of the crypt. He baptized Anne Lister, and he buried Anne Lister and Anne Walker.
Yes.
Yeah. So
he comes to Lightcliff to do a lot of the Walker baptisms. They're obviously viewed as important people in the parish. Wasn't
there a sort of controversy about the fact that he was doing that? About that there was someone who was getting paid for one job already doing a second church?
No. I think there was William Priestley was not fond of the Reverend Robert Wilkinson, who was also headmaster of a school in Halifax, Heath School in Halifax. And the quote that I read out about Anne Lister wanting a pew, you know, she was happy, especially if he gave her a pew, with the Reverend Wilkinson. But some of his other parishioners, including William Priestley, were not happy with him because he didn't live in Lightcliffe and he had this other job. And I think he was quite elderly. And Anne Lister, she usually records how long his sermons take. Perhaps that's an indication of she didn't think they were very interesting.
Right. Yes, and she didn't hold back when it came to sermons in her diary. That's very true.
No.
So we're at time now. So I want to thank the two of you for taking the time this evening to spend a little time talking about this. And I certainly want to personally thank you for the work that you do, because it's important and it's fascinating. So for all of you that are out there that are listening to this, you can sign up for the newsletter that gets published. And Dorothy is constantly coming up with interesting new bits, not just about Gentleman Jack characters, but the people in the area who's buried there and how they all tie together. So if you're a history fan like I am, please tune in. But again, Ian, Dorothy, thanks so much. We're going to send you back into the dark now.
Okay, fine.
To be transported to your own living rooms. And the rest of you, if you'll stick around for a minute, we'll talk about what else is coming up. But thank you so much. And happy Halloween.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So there you have it, Lightcliffe Churchyard. And can't urge you enough to go visit it while you're there. And hopefully during ALBW, we'll have the tower open again. Ian's agreed to do that as long as the Friends of Friendless Churches will allow him to do that. So you get a chance to see the inside and see the memorials. Wanted to once again thank my team, Steph Galloway, and today we have Cheryl McDonald and our new member, Catherine, who is filling in for Livia Labate. Thank you, as always, for taking care of all this. Also wanted to talk to you briefly about the other ALBW Lives that will be coming up. We do have several more coming up in the future. We're going to be talking about a variety of things, including the Anne Lister Society. We're going to spend a little time with the Blister Sisters talking about their climb up Mount Vignemale. We have several other people coming in from the Gentleman Jack season 2 and season 1. We have very excited about some of those guests. We're going to get some behind the scenes things. And we're also going to be talking about Mariana Lawton with Chantel. Who could know her better than Chantel? So again, I want to thank all of you for joining in. I do want you to, I am going to urge you to wear your mask as I do each time, but I also want to take 1 minute to my American audience. I honestly don't care who you vote for. I just want to make sure that you vote. It is the most important thing that we can do as citizens of the United States. And as I said, elections have consequences. We saw that in 2016. So whatever you can do to get out to vote yourself, and if you can get another couple of people to get out and vote with you, I'd greatly appreciate it. We're going to break records this year. At least I certainly hope we are. And I wish you all well. So with that, good night, and we'll see you at the next ALBW Live, and hopefully in Halifax in 2021. Good night.